I'll get right to the heart of the matter, since we'll be here a while, I think. And as Heather said, I've titled this A Christian Perspective on Interreligious Dialogue, Regression, Stagnation, Progress. This talk assesses the state of interreligious dialogue from a Christian perspective with a report that is nothing short of mixed. Interreligious dialogue is enthusiastically shared by many, ignored by most, and opposed by some. In the past 50 years, we have witnessed Vatican II, the Six-Day War, Pope John Paul II's Assisi gatherings, the attack on the Ayodhya Mosque, the opening of a mosque on the banks of the Tiber River in Rome, Yitzhak Rabin's assassination, the Oklahoma City bombing, John Paul II's visit to the Western Wall in Jerusalem, September 11th, Guantanamo, Archbishop Rowan Williams' Building Bridges seminar, the London subway bombings, Benedict XVI's Regensburg speech, and Park 51 Mosque in New York controversy, to name a few of the high and low points involving religions. Assessing the need for dialogue in the book In Praise of Religious Diversity, James Wiggins wrote, "Scholars of religion from all traditions could make significant contributions to the exploration of interreligious conversation and cooperation. Such contributions might explicate the desperate need for such a discourse at this juncture in world history. The circles of conversation will benefit from including scholars along with adherents and professional leaders of religion." As all of you who have an affiliation with the Institute for Christian and Jewish Studies know, dialogue has benefited the academy and the community in many places around the globe, while being resisted by some and ignored by others. Let me begin with the negative, regression. Let me begin with the unfortunate or negative developments and move to the positive ones so that I will end on a hopeful note. Thus, I begin with regression. In September 2000, the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of Faiths, Dominus Jesus, caused concern and consternation when it claimed, quote, "The ecclesial communities have not preserved the valid episcopate and the genuine and integral substance of the Eucharistic ministry, are not churches in the proper sense. However, those who are baptized in these communities are, by baptism, incorporated into Christ, and thus are in a certain communion, albeit imperfect, with the Church." The Roman Catholic Church was not proclaiming anything new, but at the beginning of the 21st century, highlighting the separation of Protestant communities from Catholics was not welcome in many Protestant circles. Further, the document warned Catholics that, quote, "The Church's constant missionary proclamation is endangered today by relativistic theories which seek to justify religious pluralism, not only de facto, but also de jure, or in principle." This document represented a public stance by the Catholic Church against perceived relativism, or pluralism defined in a theological sense. Writing in the Journal of Religion, Johannes van der Veer observed, "Let us take the example of the Vatican document Dominus Jesus, a declaration of the Catholic Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith from 2000, which we know testifies to undiminished exclusivism and endeavors to prevent syncretic tendencies. Does this also imply a prohibition of interreligious dialogue? No, explicitly, but in spirit it does. Although the document mentions human dignity, it does so in a way that is entirely indifferent to the beliefs of adherents of other religions and the rights in which these beliefs are expressed. In the background, the church activity identified a number of pluralists actively identified a number of pluralists whom it sought to rein in. Most notably, the Belgian Jesuit theologian Jacques Dupuy, the Sri Lankan priest-theologian Tissa Basilaria, the Indian writer Anthony de Mello, and the American Jesuit theologian Roger Haight drew the unwanted attention of Vatican officials. So what is it that happens to pluralists within their churches, particularly Roman Catholics? John Allen put it this way in his 1999 National Catholic Reporter article, The Perils of Pluralism. Clerical theologians, in particular, have come under scrutiny by the Vatican. Recently, Peter Phan, an internationally known scholar, has come under suspicion by the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith and the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, Doctrinal Committee. Espousing theological pluralism, or even suggesting that religions other than Christianity, and Catholicism in particular, have an autonomous salvific character, represents a political as well as an intellectual risk. All of the accused theologians are priests, who usually have audiences in which the Vatican has a vested interest: seminarians, clergy, and Catholic laity. Fearful that their teaching is misguided yet influential, the Vatican seeks to rein them in, sometimes using the proverbial stick rather than the carrot. Several methods can be employed to accomplish this. For those who teach in settings that are explicitly ecclesial, usually in pontifical universities or faculties, the Vatican can revoke their teaching privileges. In some instances, the Vatican proclaims that they are no longer Catholic theologians. The Vatican also recently removed barriers from priests' use of the pre-Vatican II Latin Mass. While the language about the blindness of the Jews has been excised, the liturgy still contains a prayer that all Israel may be saved, words that some Jewish leaders interpreted as asking Jews to accept Christianity. A February 14, 2008 resolution by the Rabbinical Assembly said that it is dismayed and deeply disturbed to learn of reports that Pope Benedict XVI has revised the 1962 text of the Latin liturgy. Be it resolved that the Rabbinical Assembly seek clarification from the Vatican of the meaning and status of the new text for the Latin liturgy. But in this liturgy, which the Pope has put into wider use in recent years, continues to ask that God, quote, illuminate their hearts so that they may recognize Jesus Christ, Savior of all men. The U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops issued a statement that, while not distancing itself from a papal pronouncement, underscored its commitment to Jewish-Christian relations. I quote, Pope Benedict XVI has chosen to present the relationship of the Church and the Jews within the mystery of salvation as found in St. Paul's letter to the Romans. Central to the concerns of the Holy Father is the clear articulation that salvation comes through faith in Jesus Christ and His Church. It is a faith that must never be imposed, but always freely chosen. The Catholic Church in the United States remains steadfastly committed to deepening its bonds of friendship and mutual understanding with the Jewish community. Responding to the papal decree, David Rosen, who will speak in this series later this year, the International Director of Interreligious Affairs of the American Jewish Committee and a distinguished lecturer, said, while we appreciate that the text avoids any derogatory language towards Jews, it is regretful that the prayer explicitly calls for Jews to accept Christianity. The Catholic Church teaches that those who adhere to other religious traditions, beliefs, and practices may be saved only and precisely through Christ. Their own tradition may be beneficial in this process, but it is neither sufficient nor on its own salvific. Pope Benedict XVI wrote the following in Truth and Tolerance, Christian Belief and World Religions. Can or must a man simply make the best of the religion that happens to fall to his share, in the form in which it is actually practiced around him? Or must he not, whatever happens, be one who seeks, who strives to purify his conscience, and thus move forward, at the very least, to the purer forms of religion? If we cannot assume as given such an inner attitude of moving onward, if we do not have to assume it, then the anthropological basis for mission disappears. It is the dynamic of the conscience and of the silent presence of God in it that is leading religions toward one another and guiding people onto the path to God, not the canonizing of what already exists, so that people are excused from any deeper searching. Yet, as Francis Clooney, a Jesuit who teaches at Harvard University, reminds us in a Commonweal article reviewing two of Benedict's books, Many Religions, One Covenant, and Truth and Tolerance, the search for truth is a shared search. He writes, Benedict is certainly right that deep down, dialogue is less about manners, speeches, and politics, and more about the search for truth. At the same time, the search for truth cannot mean we have the truth, they are searching for it. A view that would turn interreligious dialogue into pantomime and farce. The quest for truth obliges everyone involved, and what is learned will have consequences even for those of us who by grace know Jesus. Clearly, pluralism as a theological and soteriological theory is unwelcome in the Catholic Church. However, the irony is that, since Vatican II, the Church has encouraged respect for other religions, interreligious dialogue, and theological exploration that includes the religiously other. Even John Paul II himself has ventured into these areas with his historic 1986 meeting of religions and religious leaders at Assisi. Nevertheless, in recent years, the Vatican has taken an increasingly hardline approach to those suspected or accused of being pluralists, who would level the playing field of religions and suggest that salvation is open to all through their own traditions. The Vatican II document, Nostra Aetate, cast the Church into a sustained quest for, and sometimes a conflict about, a soteriology that is both consistent with the teachings of the Church and respectful to other religions. Balancing these important concerns requires careful analysis of and faithfulness to the Catholic tradition and a substantive and constructive dialogue with other Christians, Jews, other religions, and non-believers. As John Paul II stated in Redemptoris Missio, the universality of salvation means that it is granted not only to those who explicitly believe in Christ and have entered the Church. Since salvation is offered to all, it must be made concretely available to all. But it is clear that today, as in the past, many people do not have an opportunity to come to know or accept the gospel revelation or enter the Church. The social and cultural conditions in which they live do not permit this, and frequently they have been brought up in other religious traditions. For such people, salvation in Christ is accessible by virtue of a grace which, while having a mysterious relationship to the church, does not make them formally part of the church, but enlightens them in a way which is accommodated to their spiritual and material situation. The grace comes from Christ. It is the result of his sacrifice and is communicated by the Holy Spirit. It enables each person to attain salvation through his or her free cooperation. Catholics, however, are not alone in their ecclesial trials. After all, it was Martin Luther who declared that all who worship a religion outside of Christ is the worship of idols. Protestant denominations have vigorously pursued aberrant theologians and ministers for their pluralist views. For example, Reverend David Benke, a Missouri Synod Lutheran pastor and president of the Lutheran Church's Atlanta district, faced charges of syncretism and the suspension of his pastoral and presidential duties as a result of sharing in prayer with leaders of different faiths in a September 23, 2001 ceremony titled Prayer for America, which was held at Yankee Stadium in New York after the September 11th attacks. Missouri Synod leaders issued the charges against Benke on the grounds that prayers with Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindus implied that these differing faiths were valid avenues to God. Additionally, following Benke's suspension, LCMS President Reverend Gerard Kishenek also faced accusations of heresy and syncretism from other ministers of his church after requesting the removal of Benke's suspension. Dick Fica, a Presbyterian minister in Chicago, suffered harsh criticism from 21 congregations, one presbytery, and a conservative Presbyterian group after he asserted publicly during the Presbyterian Peacemaking Conference at Chapman University in California that he believed that there are equally valid ways to reach God besides Jesus Christ. Attempts to rein in or punish pluralists affect those in the pulpit as well as those in the classroom. And in the case of Protestants, those in administrative and pastoral leadership positions, such as bishops as well. Just a little warning, Bishop. C. Joseph Sprague, a United Methodist bishop of Chicago, faced charges of heresy after publicly espousing his pluralist views in a speech and in print. A group of United Methodist clergy accused Bishop Sprague of rejecting the teaching that Christ is the unique Savior. He underwent investigations and mediation processes that brought in their wake a range of punishments, as well as the possibility of forced resignation from ministry. In an equally distressing situation, Reverend William Keller, an evangelical Christian minister from Muncie, Indiana, denied non-Christians the opportunity to pray to their gods publicly during the Muncie National Day of Prayer service. I know all this sounds terribly dour as I read it. Many theologians and pastors who engage in dialogue, common prayer, and mutual theological exploration do not find this to be an era of parity, but work with one eye on the respective ecclesial authorities and one ear to the ground to listen for the second shoe to drop. After all, very large numbers of evangelical Christians throughout the world do not support or even oppose interfaith work. And some mainline churches are suspicious even of the most benevolent efforts to find theological common ground. Others are sophisticated but unapologetic about their theological exclusivity. For example, John Milbank's radical orthodoxy and that of other neoconservatives, including Stanley Hauerwas and John Newhouse, reject interreligious dialogue that may, erroneously in their view, call into question or modify Christian beliefs, insisting that theology should be the master discourse that positions all others. Their theology lacks openness to a mutually critical engagement with the other. In a return to Societas Perfecta views of the Church, which Mary Doak characterizes as a clash of narratives, Milbank views the other in terms of conflict and competition rather than mutual critical engagement. Doak, in a 2004 article in Contemporary Pragmatism, framed it well with this statement: "The challenge of our religiously pluralistic world no longer calls for respectful, laborious conversations in which we allow our basic beliefs to be called into question and perhaps modified. Instead, Milbank would have us recognize that others have a counter-narrative with no more claim to attention than our own, and indeed less claim to attention insofar as our narrative is working for us. Our hope for progress towards a more peaceful society is not furthered by uncomfortable exposure to others' ideas in this view, but rather by stalwartly proclaiming and living our truth that peace is possible only within our church." Nor is such xenophobia confined to the ranks of professionals. Among Americans generally, a 2003 poll reported that 43% view Muslims as anti-American, and a 2006 poll showed that 46% of Americans held a negative view of Islam. The separation from the other echoes on the individual as well. In August 2007, a dental hygiene student at Howard University College of Dentistry, who demonstrated academic promise and significant financial need, was offered a newly inaugurated scholarship funded by a former faculty member who herself was an active member of a Baha'i community. The sole condition for accepting the scholarship was that the recipient conduct one voluntary interfaith service for students at the school sometime during the academic year. The student turned down the scholarship because she belonged to a Christian church that strictly prohibited its congregants from praying with any but their own members. The student needed the money. However, given the choice between fulfilling the donor's wishes and in the process disobeying her church, she refused the scholarship. Collectively, Americans can spread fear and distance themselves from neighbors who are religiously different. Locally, in Maryland, in October 2007, a Muslim sect, the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community USA, whose origins trace back to a Pakistani holy man at the turn of the 20th century, attempted to buy 224 acres of land in rural Walkersville for a worship and retreat center. Local residents proposed an ordinance prohibiting places of worship on land zoned for farm use. The Walkerville Planning Commission took months to make its recommendation to the town council. Many citizens were concerned about traffic congestion, environmental issues, and safety. Others, however, were suspicious of and hesitant about allowing a Muslim community in their midst. One local observer wrote, "When you get down to brass tacks, Islam, especially the variety spreading through much of the world today, cannot peacefully coexist with Western civilization. One of them will have to give ground." Guess who that might be? Hopefully, one day soon, we will all awaken from our collective diversity trumps all coma. There are worse things in this world than being called insensitive. Another wrote, "I suggest the Ahmadiyya community drop their plans and move to an area which is more diverse and more accepting. Leave the locals alone who are used to their way of life." By the way, I am a Muslim. Another, who saw the issue strictly as one of land use, commented, "Because the scope of their plans is so enormous as compared to any other group that gathers in Walkersville, residents are justifiably concerned. Frankly, I would be just as alarmed if the Girl Scouts, or the National Wildlife Federation, or the Future Farmers of America, or the Southern Baptists, which wish to purchase this land and build a mega conference center to host their own national conventions of 10,000 people. So why can't the media be honest and stop making this into a religious issue? It isn't. And I resent them saying that, and so do my neighbors." The town mayor, Ralph Whitmore, observed, "Muslims are a whole different culture from us. The situation with the Muslims is touchy worldwide, so people are antsy over that." In a 4-2 vote, the commission agreed to recommend approval of the ordinance. However, in February 2008, the Walkersville Board of Zoning Appeals denied the application to build the retreat center. The various comments underscore the complexity of the situation. Clearly, it was not simply a matter of prejudice. Clearly, again, however, it was not without prejudice, demonstrating that many are afraid of the other, are unwilling to dialogue, and will go to great lengths to disenfranchise those who represent the religious minority. These theological and practical examples highlight the regression that we all hope to avoid, but cannot help but acknowledge. One dimension. I'll pick it up a little bit now, and it'll be a little more positive, but not fully. I'll call the next section stagnation. Along with the regression are instances of stagnation concerning interfaith efforts. Sometimes these are structural, sometimes they are intentional, and sometimes they are caused by higher priorities taking precedence or by a lack of resources. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops has cut its staff and curtailed or discontinued ecumenical and interreligious dialogues. In the light of the costs of the priest sexual abuse crisis, budgets are tight, and some efforts are being reduced or eliminated. Some bishops have so much on their agenda caring for their own flock that they simply do not have time for dialogue. Many academic programs do not actively support interreligious dialogue, viewing it, ironically, for academics that make a career of lecturing, viewing it as just talk. They have courses on the history of religions, ritual, theory of religion, and doctrine, but dialogue is for well-intentioned local folks, not for their rarefied classrooms. Many seminaries that train future clerical leaders, both Catholic and Protestant, do not include either courses on dialogue or courses devoted to religions other than Christianity. Sometimes this is intentional. They see no need to have their students understand any religion other than Christianity, the religion they espouse and will represent. Other times, these religions are not addressed because the seminaries do not have the faculty resources. They simply have too few faculty members to cover adequately all the necessary disciplines within Christian theology, ranging from biblical studies to systematic theology, and thus cannot place these in conversation with the philosophies and theologies of non-Christian religions. One cannot fault them for choosing to concentrate on their own Christian tradition, but the consequence can be ignorance of the wider religious world and its communities, its ideas, and its activities. In a book on the subject, I wrote the following: another issue that the Church will have to address is the education of its leaders, clerical and lay. Without questioning the importance of a thorough knowledge of the history and theology of the Catholic Christian tradition, persons who are preparing for leadership in the Church are going to have to seriously study other religious traditions also. Ignorance of them may contribute to the continuation of misunderstanding or caricature of these religions. Introduction to these religions by competent persons must accordingly be an integral part of seminary curricula and ministerial training programs. Proper explanation of these religions will not only prevent pastoral practices that promote prejudice, but will create the possibility for fruitful dialogue between religious communities, even at the local level. Fortunately, in 2007, the Luce Foundation launched a program of summer workshops conducted by theologians and comparativists such as Frank Clooney, Mark Hine, John Tadanomo, designed specifically to train seminary faculty in comparative thought. Once trained, these seminary faculty members can act as ambassadors for dialogues in their institutions. And if I might insert here, before I was at Georgetown, I taught at Drew University, which had a Ph.D. program in the philosophy of religion, but it had a large seminary contingent. And in teaching those seminarians, I always encouraged them to say, what I am teaching you, you must teach to your congregations, and you must be lifelong learners, because you will be the theologian for them. While I am the theologian for you, I won't be there. And there won't be professional theologians in your parish communities. You are the professional theologian. And if you don't take seriously your responsibilities to theology and to keeping current and to understanding theology and the world, then you do a disservice to the community to which you are assigned. They didn't clap. I remember one said to me, Professor Gillis, we're halfway through the semester, and all you've given us are ideas. And I said, oh my, I thought ideas changed the world. I said, you had an idea of going into ministry. That's why you're here. I moved to Georgetown, but they were wonderful, but I had to make sure there was no provincialism there. In 2009, the Center for Multi-Faith Education at Auburn Theological Seminary released a book called Beyond World Religions, The State of Multi-Faith Education in American Theological Schools, a first-of-its-kind study of how seminaries across the United States are dealing with the challenge to educate religious leaders for a religiously diverse world. While stagnation happens, it is not without the possibility of resolution or progress, a subject to which I now turn. Let me share with you some of the other observations that underscore the need for dialogue. Just as in the days immediately following Vatican II, when any number of initiatives was launched for dialogue between the Catholic and Protestant traditions of Christianity, so in the final decade of the 20th century and into the 21st century, regional and local interfaith dialogues must be undertaken in addition to the national and international dialogues already underway. These exchanges and encounters should be under the auspices of both diocesan bodies and individual congregations. They should continue with the initial basic objectives of dismantling caricatures and promoting proper mutual understandings of the traditions involved. Once this goal is achieved, and it is no small accomplishment, the dialogue may proceed to address mutual concerns and theological questions that arise within and out of the exchange. These mutual concerns may be social, political, or religious. It is clear that such endeavors now dot the American landscape. We have come a long way from the first Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago in 1893, when 78% of the 194 papers were delivered by Christians, and 73% of the Christian participants were from the United States. The 2004 Parliament in Barcelona, Spain, gathered 9,000 participants from 75 countries and included 450 programs, lectures, dialogues, workshops, symposia, performance, and exhibits, with 962 presenters representing faiths from all around the world. The 2009 Melbourne, Australia Parliament drew more than 10,000 participants. Kusamita Peterson wrote in an article called The Interfaith Movement, an Incomplete Assessment, and suggests that the most common motives for engaging in interfaith dialogue are, 1, to live together harmoniously, mitigate tensions, and resolve conflict. 2, to engage in a common task. And 3, to search for truth and understanding in the context of religious plurality. Interfaith organizations have seen explosive growth in the past quarter century. A 1980 study conducted by the National Council of Churches Committee on Religion and Local Ecumenism reported 24 interfaith councils in the United States. By 2006, the Pluralism Project at Harvard had identified over 500. Kate McCarthy, in a 2007 book called Interfaith Encounters in America, explores whether interfaith groups come together to achieve a common goal or if coming together is the goal. She writes, "The religious organizations heading in telephone books across American cities, no longer limited to churches and the occasional synagogue, now include mosques, Hindu temples, Sikh gurdwaras, and Buddhist meditation centers. The religions of these immigrant communities are dramatically restructuring traditional models of interfaith efforts, which used to refer to the work of Catholics, Protestants, and Jews trying to better understand each other. Community-based interfaith projects today might involve Hmong elders educating neighbors among their shamanic practices, or Sikhs inviting other local religious groups to help celebrate the opening of a new temple." At dinner tonight, I told an anecdote of I received a call at home several years ago, don't ask how they got my home phone number, from a church in Ohio, asking would I become and be the theologian for the weekend in this community. because they wanted to do something interreligious. And I said, this is very interesting. Tell me what you're doing. And they said, well, we're the Lutheran Church, and we're going to have a dialogue with the Catholic Church. And I said, do you both believe in baptism? Do you both believe in Christ? Do you both believe in the Trinity? Do you both believe in salvation? They said, yes, yes, yes. I said, what is there to talk about? I said, why don't you invite the Jews or the Hindus or the Muslims or people who are very different from you for this dialogue? That would be interesting to me. I would really love to come and to initiate that dialogue and to foster that dialogue where you are. He said, I'll call you in 20 years. I did not go. Permit me to describe the efforts of two organizations that are promoting interfaith dialogue. I begin with the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. Created in March 2006, the Berkeley Center explores the intersection of religion with contemporary global challenges, relations among states and societies, global development, democracy and human rights, and culture and identity. Two premises guide the center's work: that scholarship on religion and its role in world affairs can help to address these challenges effectively, and that the open engagement of religious traditions with one another and with a wider society can promote peace. Under the guidance of its director, Thomas Banchoff, the center sponsors lectures, symposia, and seminars by figures in the academy and the public arena, including Tariq Ramadan, Theodore Cardinal McCarrick, Anthony Appiah, E.J. Dion, Jim Wallace, Abdulkarim Sarouche, Jose Casanova, John Esposito, Gene Elstein, Yossi Shane, Robert Withnow, Rick Warren, to name a few just in the past 2 years. The center's programs have addressed a wide range of topics, including AIDS in Africa, evangelicals and foreign policy, martyrdom in Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, Islam, Catholicism, and the secular, culture, religion, and globalization, women in interreligious dialogue, and religion and migration. The center is a part of an effort by Georgetown, led by our president, John DeGioia, to be a global leader in interfaith understanding. Let me describe in more detail just two of the projects that the center has mounted. The first is titled Mapping the Role of Faith Communities in Development Policy, the U.S. Case in International Perspective. The report maps the work of faith-inspired organizations that are engaged in international development and relief work, what and where they are, what general categories may be distinguished, what they do, and what generic features they represent. It presents some of the details of a few organizations to indicate the type of organizations involved and the type of work each does. It distinguishes development, focused on long-term change, and relief that constitutes emergency assistance. The report attempts to, if not define, at least describe what constitutes a faith-based organization. In the light of George W. Bush's creation of a government Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, which assists faith-based groups to negotiate the federal grant system, this arena has taken on a larger role in American society and internationally. The report expresses concern that faith-based will mean, in essence, Christian. It reads, given the general predominance of Christianity in the United States, both practitioners and scholars have expressed concern that both on the ground and theoretical and definitional work will be subtly skewed against non-Western religions with less formal structures and different theological frameworks for compassionate action. In 2004, Ronald Sider and Heidi Roland Unruh produced a typology based on case studies of domestic community service organizations that's separated into 6 different categories, listed from the most to the least faith-based. These are the categories: faith-permeated, faith-centered, faith-affiliated, faith background, faith-secular partnership, and secular. They described categorical archetypes according to 8 criteria, some of which included mission statement, the board member and staff selection, and the financial support which they receive. While Christians likely get the lion's share of grant money, the Berkeley Center reports highlights the contributions of multiple religions: Catholic Relief Services, Mainline Protestant Church World Service, Evangelical World Vision, Orthodox, International Orthodox Christian Charities, Mormon various efforts, Jewish, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Communion, Islamic, One Ummah International, Buddhist, International Network of Engaged Buddhists, Hindu, Ramakrishna Mission, and Baha'i, the Baha'i International Community, to name some of the faith-based associations and organizations that these represent. The report cautions that religiously based organizations are not accustomed to formal evaluations, assessments being the current term in academia and elsewhere, and thus they are less likely to identify and address failures or formally strategize improvements. Another concern is proselytization. Whenever a religious organization has something to offer in terms of goods or services, it must be able to separate its social mission from its religious mission. The report notes the following. A core principle of humanitarian aid, codified in the Code of Conduct for the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, is that aid will not be used to further a particular political or religious viewpoint. In particular, the Code states that organizations will not tie the promise, delivery, or distribution of assistance to the embracing or acceptance of a political or religious creed. Most FBOs subscribe to this idea, but as more FBOs work in the relief and development field and missionary organizations increasingly offer international aid, this principle is being challenged. Sometimes the challenge is overt, as in the case of the Baptists delivering food aid with biblical verses in predominantly Muslim Iraq, or Christian aid workers in an earthquake relief camp staging plays about Jesus and holding prayer healing sessions. But in other cases, the line between proselytization and aid organizations with religious affiliation is more subtle, such as a picture of Christ on the wall or a prayer before aid workers begin their daily activities. Religious and interreligious organizations must be mindful that they exist to do good for others and not simply to do good for themselves. Actually, the center invites 10 students to serve as undergraduate fellows, and I work with them. They learn other traditions from the ground up. They mingle with each other, they understand each other's tradition, and they leave our campus with a much wider lens than they came in with. And we insist upon that. They do this in an intellectual way, sometimes in a spiritual way, and certainly in a personal way. There is one other organization I want to cite, and that is your own. And I know that you have done enormous work in the Baltimore area. You have sponsored things for 25 years. You have made a difference in this community. You are identified as a change maker, as a welcoming community, as people who are thoughtful and who are not provincial because of what you have done, because of the programs you have put on, because of the leadership that you have and the commitment that you make. There's a small crowd here tonight, and you may think you don't make a difference, but I believe firmly that in the world of interreligious dialogue, the local is king or queen. The theories of the theologians and of the university people and even of the church people have no effect unless they are concretized in the congregation and in the local community. It is the most important element of interreligious dialogue. It has to happen on the ground, person to person, community to community, individual by individual, in a local place. If that does not happen, minds and hearts are not changed, they are not open, people are not educated, and they continue to see the other, as different, as strange, or as dangerous. So I am here to say that what you are doing is important. It may not be noted, I would say, in the nightly news, but I'll say on the web. It may not be noted by the leaders sometimes, but sometimes the leaders have to learn from the followers. They have to learn from the doers, the people who are engaging in theology on the ground, who are engaging their own community, who are transforming their community, who are informing their community, and who have a vision of a different kind of society that is pluralistic, that is open, that is accepting, and that seeks the truth among us. I cannot underscore how important your work is. And as a theologian, I applaud you that you do it. I applaud you that you come out on a Thursday night to hear some guy from Georgetown give a whole repertoire of what's happening elsewhere. Well, none of that really matters if it's happening here. If it's happening here, Baltimore will be a different place because of you. And every one of you has a relationship, or multiple relationships, that will testify to that. Where prejudice is eviscerated, where people are celebrated for who they are, where we can celebrate the divine and the transcendent together, and where perhaps we will see a new vision of a different kind of religious community in the 21st century. Thank you, and I'm happy to take some questions if you're up for it.